All right, so now let's talk about chemical reactions. So before we talked about the difference between chemical properties and physical properties, and then we talked about physical changes and then chemical changes. So right now we're just focusing on the chemical changing part, right? That's what chemistry is all about, is those chemical reactions, right? So chemical reactions occur when substances undergo chemical changes and then they form completely new substances, right? So an example of that is growing. So, growing is an example through the process of photosynthesis, plants go from a seed into this green shoot that pops out from the ground, right? That is a chemical reaction happening that leads to that. And then on the bottom right over here, you have that strawberry going from like that whitish green color into a dark red color, right? So, that is actually a process of a chemical reaction happening that leads to that ripening. You have decomposing. So here you see the fruit and the vegetables. They are rotting away or decomposing. Rotting or decomposing is a type of chemical reaction, right? So things change and they look way different from before they rot and they look different after they rot. Same thing with burning and combustion, right? When you burn a log, it starts off looking like a thick piece of wood, and then eventually it just turns into ashes, right? So that these are all examples of everyday chemical reactions happening. So this is what happens when you have a chemical change. You get this chemical reaction, and which is change in which one or more substances are converted into new substances, right? And that's what we were talking about with the chemical reactions or the chemical changes. And so it's important that you remember these, right? You'll definitely see some of these concepts on the final exam. So it's important to know what reactants are and what products are. So whenever you get a kind of reaction, you're always going to have the reactants on the left side and the products on the right side. And the definition for the reactants are just substances that react, right? So you put two things together here, they go through a chemical reaction, and then what it produces are the products. I always like to think of baking when I think of these, right? The reactants are all the ingredients you put together. You send it through the oven, and then that yields a baked good, right? Whatever it was that you were baking, that is your product, right? And it looks very different. The mixture of raw eggs and batter and all that looks very different when it goes in the oven than when it comes out, right? So you've completely changed the substance. And so here's some signs of some chemical reactions. Make sure that you pay attention to these because these are definitely important. So bubbles appear, right? We saw that with the tablets when we dropped the tablets in the water and the temperature started dropping. It started fizzing and bubbling, right? Whenever you see those fizz or that bubble, that's a sign that a gas is being created. And so when bubbles appear, that is a sign of a chemical reaction. Here on the top right hand corner, you see that too, like all that foam coming out when those when those reactants are mixed. The product is this foam, right? And foam is basically just a bunch of bubbles. And so, number two, a precipitate solid forms in the bottom of the test tube. And so, this isn't a test tube, but if you look down in the bottom where the milk is pouring out, when milk starts getting rotten, it forms chunks or solids, right? These solids are a precipitate. So, whenever you have a liquid and a solid forms, that is a precipitate. And you will see that when a chemical reaction occurs. A color change occurs. So we saw that again. We can use milk as an example. When it is fresh, it's a white color, right? But when it's been sitting out on the counter at room temperature for like weeks, it turns into a green color. The temperature changes, it either increases or decreases. And we saw that with the tablets. Every time we dropped one in, the temperature went down, right? Because it was an endothermic reaction. Light is given off, often happens in combustion reactions, right? So you see right there, the sodium gets dropped in the water, and all of a sudden you see these flames shoot out, right? That is an exothermic reaction. Light and heat is given off in this case, right? And then a change in smell or taste occurs. If you think about the milk example, right? If you leave milk sitting out long enough, it will turn sour and it will just have this sour, nasty smelling odor to it, right? And so this is an example of a change in smell. And if you wanted to taste it, you could. I wouldn't recommend it, but you would have a change in taste from what fresh milk tastes like. Right, so these are all examples, signs of chemical reactions, and make sure that you carry these in with you until the last week of the term, right? So hint, hint about the final.